without further ado, I'd like to welcome our two speakers, Sandra Jamieson and Jerry Stinnett. Welcome, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Well, I'm supposed to go first, so I'll go ahead and introduce myself very quickly. I'm Jerry Stinnett. I am an assistant professor of writing at Grand Valley State University in Allendale, Michigan. And I am the director of what is called the SWS, or Supplemental Writing Skills Program there, which is essentially their WAC-WID program. I'm not technically a WAC-WID scholar. I actually do a lot more research and transfer, which is what my presentation is going to be about. So I will, without further ado, I'm going to read this so I can, as we were talking before, to keep it straight. And I will share my slides with everyone. I hope everyone can see that. This is last year writing, WAC-WID instruction as the path to broad writing-related transfer. So scholarship on writing-related learning transfer has widely argued that students can effectively repurpose their writing across contexts by acquiring rhetorical meta-awareness of writing situations. The argument goes that students can be taught rhetorical concepts like audience, genre, and discourse community and use these to analyze the specific writing situations they encounter. So equipped, students can better understand how to adapt existing writing knowledge for specific new or unfamiliar situations. The focus of this scholarship on first-year writing and on teaching generalizable rhetorical concepts has tacitly but commonly figured writing in the disciplines as one of those specific sites to which students adapt their writing. I want to argue here that discipline-specific writing instruction needs to be considered an important, if not the primary, curricular site for fostering broad writing-related transfer. Research-based and theoretical developments on writing have consistently affirmed the community-specific nature of writing and its acquisition. As David Russell notes, adolescents and adults do not learn to write, period, nor do they improve their writing in a general way outside of all activity systems and then apply an autonomous skill to specific activities, end quote. Instead, writing is community-specific, taking particular forms because these forms of writing help a given community achieve their collective goals. So when we learn to write within and with the writing and discourse conventions of these specific communities of practice. This is, in fact, the whole basis of WID instruction. But it must be remembered that learners join specific communities and activities of practice and learn community-specific writing in pursuit of the learner's own goals and objectives. Learners do not simply passively encounter communities and discourses, but also actively choose to join particular communities or participate in particular ways. This dynamic is described and theorized as the process of personal development by psychologist A.N. Leontiev. Leontiev argues that individual development occurs through the pursuit of personally meaningful objectives across leading activities. Leading activities are those activities, quote, at a given stage and are of a greater significance for the individual's subsequent development in a particular socio-historical context, end quote. We might say the leading activities of our historical social context involve family, play, primary school, secondary school, college, and work. According to Leontiev, an individual's personally meaningful goals are imposed on and shaped by the social objectives that characterize each leading activity. For instance, earning good grades is a social objective of the leading activity of primary school. But this social objective, quote, may appear in the consciousness of each individual pupil in essentially different ways, end quote. In pursuit of personal meaning, one student may impart a particular significance to earning good grades, while another may see grades as an obstacle or imposition against which they define their personal meaning. As individuals move through each subsequent leading activity, the changing social and material conditions of each activity requires the changing of how personal meaning is pursued. For Leontiev, this is in fact how individual development occurs. I will discuss this theory in relation to writing using the example of a case study I conducted of a master's student in biostatistics who was writing a paper for a statistics conference. Here, I want to use the initial data of the study as an example with which to explore some big ideas about writing and learning transfer. I will call the student Paige, a pseudonym of her choosing. Paige identifies as a female of African American and Puerto Rican descent. She received her bachelor's degree in biology from the same mid-sized comprehensive university at which she is pursuing her master's in biostatistics. As part of her graduate program, Paige is completing an internship working as a statistical support for medical researchers at a local hospital. Pitching a proposal to a statistics conference is required as part of her internship. With her proposal accepted, Paige was finalizing her conference paper at the time of this study. One of the first points I want to make about Paige's composing is that she did not simply encounter the writing situation of the conference paper. She actively made a number of choices that placed her in this situation. Due to her affinity for science, her medical history, and some personal experiences, Paige has always wanted a career in medicine, though not as a doctor or a nurse. Early in life, this desire was simply an interest in science. Paige notes, quote, "I've always liked science, doing science experiments, pretty much any of the earth sciences that I took. I always thought that was interesting," end quote. The shaping influence of Paige's interest in science on her subsequent experience is reflected in a connection that Paige makes between her primary school and college experience. When asked about specific examples of her interest in science, Paige explains, quote, "When I was in 3rd grade, we'd hatched chickens in my class. We got to pick our eggs. We got to see them go through all the phases. Like we'd go into the bathroom and the teacher would hold it under the light so we could see through the shell. So I thought that was really interesting," end quote. With no prompting, Paige goes on to describe an experience in her senior embryology course as a biology major in college. Seeing an illustration of the stages of chicken embryo development in her textbook, Paige says, quote, "I thought it was really interesting because I could remember seeing the images of the shell with the egg and stuff like that in 3rd grade. So like looking at like in our textbook, like there was the similar photos. Learning the process was really cool because it's like as a kid, I didn't really know what was going on and just thought it was interesting that there was a little bird in that shell. Where now it's like, oh, so this is what happened. So this is why things are like that. And so I thought it was really interesting," end quote. Paige is clear that she consciously made the connection between her 3rd grade and college experiences in the moment of looking at her textbook in her senior embryology course and thinking to herself at that moment that things had come, quote, "full circle," end quote. Paige's reflective moment in senior embryology speaks to the ways in which a series of experiences that might seem like disparate contexts or unrelated events can be described from Paige's view as a single process of development, of the continual pursuit of personal meaning, albeit one that evolves as she pursues it across different experiences. In this view, Paige developed and pursued this personal meaning through science projects and science classes in elementary school and middle school, and then through her interest in dissection projects in high school anatomy classes. This personal meaning found expression in college through college's social objective of choosing a major, in Paige's instance, biology. I'm suggesting that Paige's personal objective was articulated differently across these major social stages, being a good student with an interest in science in primary school, taking particular interest in high school anatomy courses, majoring in biology in college. To oversimplify a bit, getting good grades in elementary school, where she was interested in science, became majoring in biology. This is individual development as personal meaning being forced to evolve by the socially determined conditions of each subsequent leading activity. Paige's active shaping of this path in relation to socially determined objectives is the important point. In pursuit of her personal meaning, she makes decisions that allow her to pursue personal objectives in the context of each leading activity. This process necessarily involves transferring prior knowledge of how to pursue personal meaning to the new context of the next leading activity. Her prior knowledge must be adapted to the new social conditions, which is how her personal meaning and Paige herself develop. Additionally, the active pursuit of personal meaning means that Paige engages these new conditions with the expectation of using existing knowledge and also the expectation of acquiring new knowledge of how to pursue personal meaning in future situations. It is not that contexts are encountered and stimulate the activation of prior learning. Prior learning is already activated in the identification and encounter with context, shaping them according to how conditions will allow Paige to pursue her personal meaning and use the prior knowledge associated with it. Knowledge of pursuing personal meaning, of course, involves knowledge of composing. We can see how this could be playing out in Paige's use of composing knowledge when writing her conference paper, especially when we recognize the set of Paige's own decisions in which that situation is embedded. Paige has decided she wants to become a genetics counselor. Being a genetics counselor requires a PhD. To aid in her applications to genetics counseling programs, Paige chose to enter a master's program in statistics, focusing on biostatistics. Her internship is required for her master's, but Paige chose to intern at a hospital instead of with the State Department of Transportation or law enforcement. And pitching to a conference is required as part of the hospital internship. Paige does not encounter this situation. It is part of the social institutional conditions of pursuing her personal meaning in this leading activity. And by making active choices to be in this situation, Paige has already decided to use some of her prior writing knowledge. That knowledge appears to include a clear awareness of the situational constituents, the genre she is writing in, and her own processes of composing. Describing her composing process of the paper, Paige writes, quote, "I would make an outline first of everything that I want to include, and then I'll just go from normal, from start to end. So I'll start with what I need to put for an intro or background, methods or protocol, however I want to talk about it, what I need to do for a discussion and a conclusion. And then I usually start if I have a results section. I'll start that first, and I'll do methods or discussion, and then I do my conclusion, and then I write my intro last," end quote. In other words, Paige outlines some of the basic information she'll need for each section of the genre of the writing. Then she actually composes the paper in a particular order, beginning with the results section and writing the introduction last. This description of her composing process for the paper reflects the use of skills and knowledge acquired across her academic career. For instance, when asked where she learned to outline, Paige notes, "I think it's just kind of instilled in me from going through high school and middle school. That's kind of what they made us do, is make an outline so we could have a logical thought process, make sure it makes sense going through the paper, that you're not dragging people all over," end quote. Knowledge of methods, discussion, results, and other sections, not surprisingly, came much later. Paige explains she learned these in her biology classes, including writing intensive biology courses, where she was asked to read protocols and manuscripts, to assess their effectiveness, and to explain why these texts were effective based on their performance of particular conventions. Additionally, Paige explains she had to practice these genres in journals kept for biology courses. She says, quote, "So we would have to write down our findings, what we're doing, how we're doing it, all of our measurements. And then we'd have to write up our intro and conclusion. It was like writing our paper with inside this journal book," end quote. We can see here Paige practicing writing her introductions last. When asked specifically where she learned to do that, Paige notes that this practice was recommended when I was an undergrad, when I first started writing papers, and that was reiterated whether I was in a biology course or a stat course or even at my internship, end quote. Paige employs a range of other practices as well, such as considering her audience carefully, seeking feedback on drafts, and having family and friends edit for grammatical correctness and style. The knowledge that Paige employs for the conference paper is what might be described as a combination of more general and more discipline-specific skills and practices. But I'm suggesting that from Paige's point of view, these composing skills were learned to pursue Paige's personal meaning in different leading activities and transferred forward to continue doing that objective specific work. Paige has learned to write to pursue personal meaning, and she repurposes those writing skills and knowledge that remain useful for achieving her personal meaning in subsequent activities. Outlining was learned to accomplish personal meaning through the social objectives of middle and high school. It has remained useful for pursuing personal meaning across subsequent experiences, so she has retained it. Other writing skills and knowledge have fallen away. The only skill she mentions that she has retained from undergrad writing instruction is writing her introduction last, a skill that both remains useful and has been reiterated in her biology major and internship. So writing skills like outlining are applied generally, but only in the sense that they are applied across a range of Paige's experience. But this range of experience is organized by Paige to allow her to pursue her personal meaning. Outlining is still objective specific. In other words, Paige does not ever learn writing skills to be applied across all contexts, even when she applies them across all the contexts of her experience. She learns objective specific skills that she transfers as a matter of course when pursuing personally meaningful objectives. Learning such skills is precisely the act of acquiring them in a generalizable enough form to adapt them to subsequent situations to pursue personal meaning. When these skills prove insufficiently adaptable for this purpose in a new leading activity, she acquires new or different skills and knowledge. This increasingly includes more and more complex forms of writing. The more complex are the social objectives of the leading activity. So it's not only limited to skills of writing papers. The way she writes emails to professors and various other skills and genres for navigating the bureaucracy of higher education are part of her expanding repertoire required to pursue her personal meaning in higher education. Paige has learned writing within the pursuit of her personal meaning and is expanding what that involves as pursuing personal meaning takes place through more and more complex social objectives. Her writing used to accomplish her personal meaning is becoming generalizable, but only because and to the extent the pursuit of personal meaning requires this accretion of skills and its deployment across her experiences. From this perspective, Paige's major as an undergrad and her graduate work as preparation for pursuing this personal objective beyond the university are sites in which she is acquiring skills and knowledge, including of writing, that she will use to organize and deploy in experiences beyond the university. In the leading activity of college, the selection of a major is most likely to be the formal curricular site through which students pursue personal meaning. This makes discipline-specific writing instruction a particularly important, if not the primary site for fostering writing-related transfer. So, we need to give Paige writing skills that will work across all contexts, again, such as knowledge of audience, genre, discourse, etc. But this knowledge must be made into knowledge of accomplishing her personal meaning. Moving forward, transfer supportive instruction may best be served by focusing on theorizing how best to help students develop meta-awareness as part of WID instruction. If there is to be a distinct site of transfer supportive writing instruction, it would seem to be better carried out not as first-year writing, but as last-year writing. Thank you.
Thank you. So if people have questions that they want to ask now, you should write them in the chat so you don't forget them. You raised some really interesting points there that I think we'll have a lot to talk about. My name is Sandra Jamieson, and I'm the second presenter and technically the chair. Whatever that means. So I am the director of writing across the curriculum at Drew University, which is in New Jersey. I will talk about a little bit about the history of the program. So you should know that I started as director of first year writing and then took over as director of writing across the curriculum when our previous director left, just so that that makes sense as I'm going along with my presentation. So I'm gonna try to share my screen. Sorry, now you're all seeing 100 different screens, I think. Maybe, no. You know, this reminds me of my classes when I think everything is going to go right and it actually doesn't. I think now you should see a PowerPoint. Is that right? I can't see you. Yes, do we see it? And you hear me? Thank you, Annie. Okay, I knew something wouldn't work. Depending on where you have your little bit of picture of person, this is not the beginning of the PowerPoint, by the way, either. We're really doing well here. There's a bit.ly at the top. So if my scrolling backwards through an entire PowerPoint here is more confusing, you're very welcome to follow that link and you should come to the same thing. I also realized that my works cited list didn't end up on this one, so it will be on the bit.ly one later. Okay, so with all of that preamble, I arrived at this conference with a presentation all ready to go, which is not always the case. But over the last couple of days, I've rethought it. And I think if I had heard Jerry's presentation yesterday, I would have incorporated that into this as well. And that's what I love about conferences, and it's what I've missed about conferences. So thank you, IWAC. But what has happened is instead of the proposal I thought I was going to make, I have a bunch of questions instead, and I will leave plenty, hopefully, time for those at the end. So I start still with the assertion that when WAC is part of Gen Ed, the challenges it faces are not faculty reluctance or disciplinary differences, but administrative silos that often don't even involve the WAC director or faculty. The pedagogical and curricular goals of WAC, grounded in theory and research, can be lost or ignored as curricula are bounced between committees, deans, schools, provosts, student services, and all the other non-faculty stakeholders of Gen Ed. I pose that as a double-edged sword. On the one hand, Gen Ed provides institutional support and curricular mandate for WAC. On the other, there's almost certainly a loss of autonomy and the possibility of the program being up for grabs every time there's a Gen Ed revision, regardless of how successful it is. There's also the risk of an overemphasis on structure and assessment of things that we might not consider indicators of success. I'll demonstrate this through a discussion of 3 revisions to a Gen Ed embedded WAC program, which I was going to argue are all driven by deficit thinking, which I blame on Gen Ed, while one has the potential to be student-centered, what Neal Lerner calls asset-driven. Now, it may seem as if there's no connection between Jerry's presentation and mine, and actually that's not entirely true. What he's talking about is the student who is in the major, and what I'm talking about is the student who's not in the major. So how do we make this program perhaps work for the students that he was studying? David Russell's talk on Monday got me thinking about what it means for WAC to be allied with Gen Ed, and it left me feeling that there's much to celebrate about the alliance. If we can avoid the neoliberal elements that have crept in since the initial alliance in the 1980s. So then I saw potential in the moment we occupy at Drew right now, as we navigate the piecemeal rollout of a Gen Ed revision via Zoom without the robust overview that in-person conversations generally afford. So I revised the paper. As you can hear, I'm revising again. Then at 7 p.m. last night, a few people were in a session with Tom Deans and Erica Schrerer, and they upended my thinking again. And now I'm left with another question, which I'll try to get to quickly, aided by a somewhat heavy-handed set of visual metaphors. I proposed this presentation before COVID upended the bureaucracy of so many colleges and universities, and I present it not knowing the full impact of the pandemic and responses at my own institution. Since I wrote my proposal, we've had a complete change in upper administration, staff layoffs, and outsourcing of almost everything aside from faculty, not to mention a hiring and salary freeze and a work speed up. I know I'm not alone in that list. Context matters, but we are not unique. So instead of the pretty slide with a picture of the bell tower and data about the size and profile of our student body, I'm going to present a decontextualized journey through WAC and Gen Ed at one institution and hope that the larger questions resonate more broadly. A few years ago, and this explains my metaphor, Jamie White Farnham and Brianna Siegel Feiner, whose name I just mispronounced, asked me to write an essay for their collection writing program Architecture, which is a great collection if you haven't seen it. They asked me to describe Drew's writing program as a built structure, subject to the challenges faced by all other buildings. And it's a way of thinking that has stuck with me. So as I think about our WAC program, what comes to mind is Gaudi's Basilica Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. If you've ever seen this, you'll know that every day the cranes are in a different place and the scaffolding has moved. Like it, we, and I would argue Gen Ed in general, seem to be perpetually unfinished. The foundations for the program might be in place, but as with the Basilica, we may have lost the plan for the final tower, can't agree whether it should be finished at all, and have to contend with complaints about the impact of the footprint and the tourists on the neighborhood. So we tweak, or maybe we build add-ons or new towers, but the edifice itself remains. I was hired at Drew to direct first year comp, which was its own one course requirement for many years. But the dean kept suggesting that I should start a WAC program, albeit with no budget and no institutional support. He just liked the idea of WAC. I spent a decade doing what I called stealth WAC, lots of coffee and lunch conversations with faculty about writing that really look very similar to the bi-weekly brown bags that we do now that we have a WAC program. That laid the groundwork. And with our first major general education revision in 2008, the dean and I got our official WAC program with a vertical writing curriculum that was a Gen Ed requirement. We even got to hire a WAC director, although she still had no budget and no institutional authority. Using faculty focus groups and other campus models, we created an elegant vertical structure towering up like Gaudi's cathedral. and we thought it was finished. First year comp was no longer expected to inoculate students against bad writing. The faculty acknowledged that communication is everyone's responsibility, and they got to work adding or tweaking writing assignments in existing courses quite happily. But like this diagram, our focus on verticality left us with a hollow framework. We can see where the bones are, the formulaic structure, but in our work on building it, we lost sight of why we were building it. And so I returned to the basilica. While the outside is still very much a work in progress, the inside is awe-inspiring and pretty much finished. Indeed, Gaudi insisted that the nave be completed first to inspire those building the rest of the edifice. And in this, I think he was very wise. These pictures are a little distorted, but I wanted you to see both the windows and also the vertical structures. Back in the 10th century, when it became possible to add stained glass windows to Gothic and Romanesque cathedrals in Europe, the windows were used to tell the story of Christianity to the illiterate masses, educating while also delighting them. But a deeper, and some said more significant, role of the windows is that as light flooded through them onto the cathedral floor, it literally bathed those inside in the stories, and by extension, the word and the perfect light, or God. While reading the stories in the windows, those below were believed to be spiritually transformed. Shifting our attention from the structural aspects of the cathedral allows us to see this interior work that I think is easy to lose sight of in the curricular structure of Gen Ed. To put it another way, what happens when we focus on the structure and form of vertical writing transfer programs, the exterior, and fail to consider the curriculum holistically from the inside, focusing on the work it's doing, intentionally and unintentionally, and the things students take from it, one experience at a time. What made me start thinking about this is the process at the very beginning of approving the program. So we started with shared, community-generated, shared outcomes, writing as a mode of learning, analytical and critical thinking, writing as a way to enter conversations. And we worked with faculty about what the curriculum would look like if they incorporated those things. But then came the approval process. The curriculum committee that approved all courses did not include anyone from the general education program. From the writing program. And they weren't sure how to measure the things on the outcomes that the faculty had come up with. So instead, they looked at some other schools, they told us, and the form required faculty simply to assign 18 to 20 pages of writing, engage students in revision, and that meant they had to show that there would be different due dates for papers as they were revised, and 50% of the final grade had to be in writing. And then there's this amorphous thing at the bottom where the course is supposed to build on writing assignments and outcomes from other courses, although it didn't list them, nor does it list the list of outcomes. So we've gone from this kind of idealistic, this is the interior, to what I would argue is a focus on the exterior, the countable things. So as simplicity is the word of the day, I'm now moving to another visual metaphor. Although there are many layers to this. This is a can. Before they became Instagram props, littering the beaches and beautiful places of the world, they were used to signal pathways and to mark burial sites. They're also used as devices for meditation and balance. But when you look at it, if you don't know any of that, all you see is a pile of rocks with no relationship between them, except perhaps that they decrease in size. And if there's no relationship and students can take these electives at any time, and they're not taking these to build the same kind of connections as they would within a major, how do we build skills transfer? How do we facilitate that? How do we, if they're not taking the 1, 2, 3, where do they learn things and where do they build on them and how do they do those things? And then, because it's Gen Ed, how do we assess what the students have learned? We took a step in the right direction, and this slide ought to be called Sandra got a grant, although actually my program got a grant. It was for 3 years to fund undergraduate course embedded writing fellows. Faculty could request them, and they were in about 1/3 of the writing intensive courses. The fellows were trained to repeat and build on the writing process learning from the first year writing course. So we still had the standalone course, and the fellows took the language from that course and the idea of writing process and the idea of conversation, and then incorporated those in the courses that they were fellows for, working with the students to, and I think the most important part was to teach them the language of writing so that there was a consistent language across slides. But we still had a pile of rocks. In 2016, we had a new gen ed revision, and I apologize, I just completely messed up all of my slides here. What did we do that was different? It wasn't really a new gen ed, it was just a new first year. So we took away that generic seminar and we made a writing intensive, the committee, made a writing intensive first year course. They included a studio writing course, also known as a sidecar, kind of attached to that seminar. There were shared goals, shared outcomes, a shared value rubric, and a lot of training for the faculty who taught the Drew seminar, who then cycle through teaching writing intensive courses and writing in the major courses. So they are now carrying that language from the first year through themselves. The downside is we lost, when the grant ended for the fellows, Drew's commitment to continuing that shifted, and the fellows were placed in the first year writing seminar instead of in the WAC courses. So you win some, you lose some, but I think ultimately that wasn't such a bad idea. It's now still a pile of rocks. My apologies, there's a scramble of pieces. I thought I would be clever and read this so that I didn't get behind, and now there's a scramble of pieces of paper all over my floor. In the tradition of the Scottish grandfather whose name I carry, adding stones to a cairn signifies respect and a desire to preserve the integrity of the monument. We'd added some stones, we'd preserved the integrity, and again, we thought we were finished. But what we actually still had, while a slightly more interesting pile and slightly more mindful with a slightly more solid base, the same model shaped by what I would call a relentless verticality that symbolizes a model of progressive accumulation that we didn't actually achieve. The idea structurally was that students would move from less skilled writers to more skilled, building on what they've learned, even though they're not doing that in any kind of sequence, but moving ever closer to an ideal of what a writer should be by graduation, an ideal that then would be displayed in their final capstone course, that senior year writing course, which we would assess. And that takes us back, I think, very nicely to the Basilica. As each carefully carved stone is transported across Barcelona and lowered onto a tower by the coordinated effort of crane and scaffolding, the Basilica comes closer to Gaudi's design and the models he left for the architects, which are followed without deviation. So what can we do instead? If the deficit model doesn't give the students agency, what kind of model can we create that does? So this finally leads me to Neal Lerner and the title of my paper. Curriculum design needs to reflect the values we hold dear, a belief in the importance of student agency or honoring the assets they bring to instructional contexts and of literacy's transformative potential, rather than a defined and fixed set of outcomes. So here we are, the next gen ed revision. You have to have one every 10 years for those of you who are not at small liberal arts colleges. And what we have is a slightly more complicated model. Writing is the same. Writing intensive was renamed writing enriched. But aside from that, not very much has changed in terms of the structure, except there's something interesting going on in these little green circles. I don't know if you can see the green. They're the dotted ones. These are electives that students don't have to take, that include immersive courses, internships, community-based learning, international off-campus programs, which count or can be counted as writing enriched courses. So suddenly we've broken open the set curriculum of, well, you have to take a biology course that is writing enriched. You can take a community-based learning course and you do writing and you reflect, and that counts as one of your writing enriched courses. So students can begin to select their own courses, select their own journey, select the things they're interested in. This is not new to the whole world, but it's new to us to break open the kind of curricular stranglehold and allow other things to enter. But there's another part of this new gen ed that causes me the question. So we still have a pile of rocks, but we also have a pile of other things. And this is a really messy slide. We don't yet have the official diagram that will go on the website that shows what our gen ed is. So this is just all the parts being moved around on the table. But what you see in the bottom corner is a thing called Drew 110, which is a course interestingly run out of the renamed Career Center that we now have branded as Launch. So students launch themselves into their education and into their lives. And the course, which comes with a writing fellow, although trained by the Career Center, not by me, introduces students to the idea of immersive learning and also has an e-portfolio and tracks them through these green circles, these green circle courses, of which they have to take 2. Being a writing fellow has now become a mentored, immersive experience, and students can apply actually to have that count for credit if they want to. So here's the question that I have. I was ending here and proposing this as a marvelous thing. But the question is, should WAC try to insert itself more centrally as part of the traditional gen ed and the extracurricular components that are being rolled out, actually one at a time? Many of the launch fellows were trained as writing fellows, even though I'm not involved in their overall training. So suppose we made that connection more intentional and developed a design of instruction or a model in meaningful reflection that would allow the students to write the reflections in all of these little green circles in ways that they had learned to do in one of their writing courses, rather than learning. I don't know where they learn how to do that. Suppose we actually use the same e-portfolio as the students in Drew 110, and we ask the students to submit the work that they now submit into the writing portfolio into that launch portfolio. There's all kinds of possibilities for assessment, and it seems pretty exciting to me. In fact, it seems like a no-brainer, except that Drew 110 and Launch is a student services program, and the wall between student services and academics is quite high. And there are also power and labor dynamics that make it fairly difficult to imagine working together. So, my final metaphor. The other model that Tom Deans and Erica Schwerer left me imagining is a totally hands-off approach. Students write in lots of courses and contexts. And I guess Jerry also makes me think of this. We don't have to count all of them. We could trust them to actually learn how to write what they wanted to write. We shouldn't necessarily try to structure and control the whole program. I'm not really a control freak, even though I probably seem like one. There's so much scholarship and so many studies that show that writing in context beyond the major and academic courses is important to students, and just letting them choose that without counting it for something, just letting it be. They can paint a pebble, they can build a cairn, or not. They can arrange the rocks in pretty colors. Tom's research on STEM students, and you can listen to the recording of I3 to hear both Erica and Tom's research, calling for writing that allows the students to explore other things that are harder to assess, and also things that might give us and them some joy. So this leaves me, after this slide, with 3 models rather than the one that I wanted to propose. And I'm going to leave you with these, and then maybe we'll get to discuss them. The first is an alliance model where we connect this extracurricular initiative into an intentional program. We create paths for skills transfer and assessment across writing experiences that are not all academic. We're in the middle of a middle states evaluation. I think they would probably like that. The Middle States Committee would certainly like that. It could create a better WAC program, but it could also dilute the program as more and more administrative entities with more institutional power than writing assert their stake on writing instruction. So then there's the asset model. Use these student selected experiential courses as a model for a broader vision of writing that creates the space for an asset-based curriculum where students decide what counts. So rather than simply saying, okay, you can count a couple of these courses that we've put in green circles, you can count anything that has writing. You have to justify it as part of your gen ed portfolio. As I said, this requires there to be a shared portfolio across the whole program, which doesn't seem as if it might work at this point. But also there's huge labor and turf issues that coming out of COVID, this may not be the right moment to propose something like that, although maybe in the future, in the next gen ed revision. But the third model is the hands-off model, embracing bursts of writing everywhere. So keeping gen ed, keeping the WAC program, but also just allowing for the fact that writing is going on all over the place, not trying to have any control over it, but encouraging it and sort of putting it on posters. This is exciting, but the fear is that then maybe it seems as if we don't need WAC at all, that writing is happening all over the place and we can just let students go do it. So those are the 3 models. You may have other models. You may think that those are all crazy. I'm really interested in hearing how other people approach these dynamics between gen ed and WAC. So if anybody wants to share that, that would be great. And I'm done. Thank you. And hopefully now people are going to post questions for both of us in the chat. Oh, what is a brown bag? I'm so sorry. Thank you. It is a nice way of saying we're not providing lunch. It's an informal get together, which feels at least at my place, they're quite a tradition. It feels less threatening than saying we're having a meeting and you have to come. It's just, okay, well, you know, come bring your lunch or get lunch if you want to. They're usually held in the cafeteria. So yeah. Okay, more serious questions. Questions for Jerry. There's enough people here that I think the questions should go into the chat, although if anybody is having chat issues and wants to raise their hand, I will try to notice you. You should definitely do the icon of the hand rather than your own hand. Carol, thank you. So the hands-off model might not be appropriate to a large public institution that admits anyone in the top half of their high school class. I think that's probably where I am. We have more and more transfer students coming in. Somebody's started the rumor that you can go to a 2-year college and save a lot of money and then transfer to a liberal arts college and miss the first 2 years where all of the structural program is put into place and just kind of go for it. So the hands-off model is what they actually have because they've missed the bottom half of the structure. And I don't know whether that's true at a public, whether that would be the case at a public institution or not. Nikki said, Nikki, yes, says, how many of these models approach supporting faculty? Supporting faculty, what is that? This is why we have brown bag lunches. What, can you talk a little bit more about what you mean? You can say that out loud. Oh. I think that's a really good question. Because, so we have an annual 5 or 6 days split over the beginning and end of the summer workshop in teaching faculty in teaching the first year seminar. And then we do the follow-up brown bags. So the faculty who want help in thinking about teaching with writing, anyone who wants it can get it. They email me or the director of first year writing, and one of us will have as much of a conversation as they like. With the launch program, some of those courses are not taught by faculty, and I don't know whether they don't realize that they need to know something about writing, or whether there's a kind of, I don't know, turf. I don't want to keep using the word turf. I don't know why they're not reaching out to faculty for feedback, but there's at the moment quite a large split between staff and faculty, partly I think because staff have been losing their jobs. So they have a really good reason to want to hold on to what they've done and not give up any control over it. Jerry, can you see the questions? Do you want to respond to that one?
Yeah, so Jen says, Jerry, you make such a strong case for disciplinary writing. I wonder, could attempting to ensure that's possible for all students face some of the same challenges involved in making undergraduate research available for all? And what about other things students do throughout college that they may get deeply involved, embedded in, whether workplace or community oriented? Could those pathways be marshaled to similar ends, do you think? I think they could. I don't want to, just ramble, but a couple of things I found with Paige was that when I say personal meaning, I'm oversimplifying a bit it to kind of one thing. There's actually usually 3 or 4 at least major threads, it seems like, in the 4 students I've studied the past year, where that matter to them. And it's the reason I kind of focus on discipline specific writing is because what I keep seeing is that the social structure of college forces them to abandon some of these. So for instance, Paige was in choir her whole academic life. She gets to college and she takes a choir class, but to stay in choir, she has to take this 3-credit class that does not count for any credit. And so she can't afford it, and she doesn't see why she would do it. And she really loves it, but she's deciding which of these paths is the one where I'm going to go forward from here on out, because apparently the world is telling me I have to choose one. So she kind of goes, okay, I don't do choir anymore. And I will say, I do see her using a little bit of the language of performance when she talks about presenting her papers. And so maybe it's morphing into that. I can't speak to that. But there was another student I have been studying who was very politically active, and she gets to college and says, I don't read the news anymore. I don't do any of it. And when you try to pin down why that is, it's because to do that in college requires you to be so invested in student senate and all these other things. And she's finding that she has to be really focused on her exercise science classes. So I think they absolutely have multiple ones. Paige is also big into baking. But they tend to serve, and I don't think she's abandoning baking. Like, she sees it as connecting back to her mother and her grandmother, and she's moving that forward. I think there's lots that go forward. I think if I'm going to try, I guess I'm feeling the pressures that Sandra's feeling, that I've got to come up with a program, then the one that's going to catch most students is going to be, let me put this in the major and I'll try to support that. So that's to answer that sort of latter part of the question. That's kind of where I came up with that approach. It's the limitations of what I can do as a WAC director to try to, pigeonhole it. But this all actually comes out of research of trying to talk about first year writing originally and thinking about let's connect whatever. Let's connect it to choir. Let's connect it to baking. But let's connect it because one of the interesting things about Paige is she says, I'm a bad writer. She's clearly absolutely successful and fantastic as a writer, but she defines writing even after all this time as the last step of grammar and style. She's terrible at it. But she's actually not terrible at that because she has found a way to use family and friends to solve that problem for her. But I feel like if I tell her, okay, I'm going to teach you to write, that pigeonhole of hers is so strong that she is going to say, well, when I'm doing that, these are the things I should think about. And I've decided I don't care. It's okay if she says that's writing, as long as she's thinking so rhetorically about the process. If she only calls that one piece writing, that's fine with me, so long as she's doing it in a very effective way. Now, the question of challenges involved in making that available for all, I think that's really difficult. I absolutely agree. The reason I mentioned first year writing is because I came at it through trying to get my students who seem to get exactly what I was talking about in rhetorical concepts, and then not use them in other places. They'll use them in other gen ed classes sometimes, but never like in their life. When I would run into them later, oh, I used what you told me in my philosophy class. Oh, have you pursued philosophy? No, that was my sophomore year. I don't do that stuff anymore. They just leave it. So this comes from me saying to myself, okay, what does it take for me to get students to take it with them? If it means teaching a course that's not a writing course, but I call it something else so that they say, oh, you're teaching me how to bake better. And part of that is doing the writing more effectively. That's what I'll do. Even in that, and I mention that just because even in that space, how do you customize that? It's what David Russell talked about. The university is not structured to do writing that way. And so it's really hard. And so I'll be honest, I have no answer to how to make this available to all. I guess my defense is I haven't gotten to that part yet, or maybe I should have started with that part and didn't, but I'm just trying to theorize how the transfer works and then think, okay, if that's how it works, how do I implement it? And then that's when you run into all the limitations. So I'm sorry to ramble on. I just, that's kind of where I'm coming from.
See, and I think Paige is the student that supports the argument for the alliance model. She could take a writing for social media course as one of her gen eds, so then it would count, and she could blog about baking. And in the reflection at the end of the course, she would write about the connection between baking and science, for example.
Right, which is a connection, by the way, she starts to make. I'm sorry to interrupt, but she made that connection herself. Go ahead. I apologize.
No, that's so then she has a box to make that connection in. And once you start writing that connection out, that makes gen ed seem a little bit more meaningful, because students can pursue the thing that they're most interested in rather than having to find a writing enriched course that meets at 9 o'clock in the morning and doesn't conflict with the lab. So definitely not rambling there. I think these are the students that we need to think about, and whichever way in we go, we still are aware of how unfinished the whole edifice really is. A couple of people have said that they've asked students what they had to give up as part of their major. And I think that's a really brilliant idea as we think about the other courses that we might be adding, or what did you have to give? What did you wish you didn't have to give up? And is there a way that we can build that into whatever our courses look like? Yeah, Crystal, I know your launch is called Elevate because we looked at yours. And I think you did use the same consulting firm because you have the same website too. And that's another larger structural problem, at least amongst liberal arts colleges. There's the same consulting firm telling us to do the same thing and build the same website. So not only do we have our own little rigid calcified pile of rocks, but there's a bigger pile of rocks amongst all the slacks that make them look the same. That may be a conversation to be continued at some point.
I will speak to that just briefly to say that the more I do this, the more I realize that the outside entities, whether it's outside of the expertise about writing or outside a particular college or whatever, it's one of the great challenges I find to get people to even understand a recommendation. Like the idea that I would recommend that we should talk about it as a baking class. Whether you agree with that or not, the rationale behind it doesn't even make sense to most people outside of the discipline. And so I don't know, I wrote down stealth WAC. That's exactly what we do. I'm just trying to get as many people as possible to talk to me so they can make their own decisions about, now that I know how this sort of works, okay, and how writing is learned, now I can make a decision in my discipline how to teach it. That's kind of been my approach. And maybe that speaks to Jen's suggestion of how do we get more faculty involved, because I want their expertise as well, but I find I can't make a recommendation, which is all they want often, unless they understand where the recommendation is coming from. Like, it won't make sense. I don't know if that's a tangent, but it's just the challenge I keep running into.
There are some great suggestions and comments in the chat, and I'm going to capture that, if you don't mind, and just make it available along with the PowerPoint, just so that if anybody wants to see the recommendations and things, I don't know whether you can capture chat, but apparently I can. So we're kind of getting close to the end of our allotted time.
I'm so sorry.
Please
Sandra.
have I was going to ask you to have the last word. So.
Well, no, I don't want it. I just was going to say to Chris, the writing to become, there are people like Paul Pryor, Kevin Rusin, who talk about ontogenesis as this semiotic remediation, and all that theory. But the idea basically being students write to become, and that's where you got to get into that flow, right? Like, if you want them to take your instruction with you, put it into that stream, and they will take it, because they are writing to become. They're not thinking I'm writing, they're thinking I'm becoming. I want to be this, and so I think Dylan Dreyer has also made some arguments about that from a neuroscience perspective, like that you need to think of where they're going and kind of surreptitiously get this instruction to be seen as part of that, right? But I'm sorry, I don't want the last word, Sandra. I'd rather hear from someone else.
Well, I'm just connecting again. I'm going back to I think I'm going to go back to the alliance model and try to have that conversation with my folks again, because, and this is a response also to Crystal in some ways, that there's pressure from the outside entities, but how do we make them our own? How do we help people see that writing is something that students do in order to become? And that's the connection between WAC and these externally kind of supported launch your life kind of programs. So maybe I'll back off, and I should have just kept the original proposal. But does anybody else want to have the last word, or should we just thank you all very much for coming and for making great suggestions, both in the chat and in person? Is that a good thing to do? And you can all run off and have a cup of coffee before the next session, where I will probably see a bunch of you. So thank you very, very much, everybody. Thank you. And thank you.